Well, welcome, Sod Sister, to the inaugural Herdmates podcast. So, with
Thank you.
all that clumsy attempt at humor, Adele, you're one of the first people I met on this journey once I got out of my own house and started meeting people in the space. But for the benefit of people that don't know you, pretend you're at some kind of dinner party, and who is Adele Hite?
And my children are nowhere around to stop me from.
Correct. Yes,
Okay.
there's no fear of contradiction or
Okay.
yeah.
Well, my children will just, yank me aside if I start yammering about nutrition, just because
Mm.
they've heard enough already. They usually have a stopwatch on me. Um, so how did I get here? I think my journey is at least as interesting as yours. And but there's a part of me that says that I couldn't have escaped this if I'd wanted to. I was introduced to low carb nutrition through my own personal journey, which a lot of us are, when I ended up overweight and pre-diabetic and pre-hypertensive after 3 children and many years of eating a home-cooked, low-fat, calorie-restricted, vegetarian diet. And my husband married me anyway, so that was true love. But after my third child, I just could not lose that weight. And not only could I not lose weight, but I kept gaining weight. So I'm actively trying to lose weight and I'm actively gaining weight at the same time, which was just really, the kind of thing that
Demoralizing.
it's demoralizing. And it also gets you labeled a crazy person. If you tell that to a mainstream nutrition person, they assume you're lying, or they assume that you obviously don't know how to eat. You're putting food in your mouth and you're not accounting for it somehow. I knew how many calories were in my toothpaste. This is because it was demoralizing and frustrating. You're like, I'm sure I'm doing this wrong. And so you tighten down and, try and cut out more calories and this and that. And it was just so utterly frustrating that I became convinced that it was something about my health, my thyroid. That's always the culprit. And back then, the internet, this was back in the olden days when we didn't even have Google. So I couldn't really go to the internet and go, what the hell is going on? So I went to the doctor, and the doctor told me in a very helpful manner that, yes, I was obese at that point, pre-diabetic, pre-hypertensive, and that what I needed to do was eat less and exercise more. And
Why hadn't you thought of that already?
right. And he was a little guy, and I was considerably bigger than him. And I just thought I could snap you in two, buddy. And I really considered doing it. He backed slowly out of the room and sent his PA in. And this guy, Bruce Bear, I think was his name. I will never forget what he told me that day, although I didn't believe a word of it at the time. He said, you're doing all this exercising that you say you're doing, you probably need to make sure that you're eating enough protein, because it doesn't really sound like you are. And maybe you don't want to worry so much about the fat in your food. It might really be the carbohydrates that are the problem. And you might want to think about just cutting back on those some and not worrying so much about the fat, because the fat usually comes with protein and you really need your protein. And I just thought, what is this man telling me?
What year was this?
This would have been 1999.
Okay.
Yeah, so before the second wave of low carb, before all of that, it stuck in my craw enough. And I'll tell you what caught my attention was the protein part, because during my third pregnancy, I had two difficult my first and second pregnancy were difficult. My babies were born a number of weeks premature. My second one spent some time in the special care nursery as a result. And my obstetrician had told me with this third pregnancy that I was to stop being such a strict vegetarian. Now, I didn't eat meat, but I just tried to limit other animal foods. I wasn't a vegan, but I just, eggs were bad for you, so don't eat too many of them, right? So he told me that I needed to have a big serving of protein with every meal. And whether it was animal protein or whatever, he didn't care. But I ate a lot of eggs during that pregnancy. And I think I even started eating some meat then as well. But as soon as I got home and the baby, I had a very healthy pregnancy, and my third child was, born on his due date, very close to it, healthy. We got to take him right home. I recovered very quickly. But as soon as I got home, I was back on my vegetarian diet. And it never occurred to me that it would be, that would be contributing to my weight gain.
Mm-hmm.
But the protein from my OBGYN and then the protein from this PA, they sort of stuck in my head. And I went to the health sciences library at UNC because that was a nearby university, took my little one during nap time, rolled him through the stacks and started pulling out old nutrition books and reading about how important protein was, but also that carbohydrates were mostly just for energy. You didn't need them for anything else, really. And that body fat was stored energy. And so I'm beginning, the wheels are starting to turn, and I'm thinking, if I'm trying to get rid of the stored energy on my rear end, why am I just putting energy in my mouth? And, the light was beginning to glimmer, but I was still not getting it because these ideologies that we believe in are hard to shake. And I'd been a vegetarian since the early 1980s when I'd picked up a copy of Diet for a Small Planet. So it wasn't just my health that I was concerned about, but I was concerned about all of these other political factors, and changing my diet was entangled with them. But I'm at story time at the local library. I'm sitting on the floor with my kids, and in the stacks behind me, there's a book called Protein Power. And of course, protein is on my brain these days. And I grab it and I start leafing through it, sitting there with my kids. And I read the line, no essential carbohydrate. You don't have to eat carbohydrate. If you never ate carbohydrate again, you'd be fine. I was just stunned. I couldn't believe it. But the book intrigued me enough. I checked it out. I eventually bought my own copy, and I was a Protein Power person from then on, and not a vegetarian anymore. And the weight came off easily, and something else really bizarre started to happen. All of a sudden, I'd been a very thin person growing up, and when I became fat, I was a skinny fat person. So I was sitting at the dinner table one night with my hands folded like this, and I felt my arm felt really weird, and I asked my husband what was wrong with my arm. He came over and he sort of grabbed it and felt it, and then he grabs the other one. He feels that. He goes, Adele, I think you have a muscle. And I did. For the first time in my life, I had a bicep. And I was still exercising and working out. I just changed my diet. And I had begun to develop muscle where I had not been doing it before, I think because probably my protein levels had been inadequate. And that was it. I was sold. Here my body is recomposing itself in a good way. The fat is coming off, the muscle is coming on. I'm enjoying what I eat. And I feel great. I felt better than I had in years. So that's how I got there. And all of a sudden it's like, why was I sold this bill of goods? And while all of this is going on, my kids are little. I'm part of the PTA, and guess who is on the PTA board with me? But Eric Westman. And I start hearing about the diet that he's studying over at Duke, and he hears about the diet that I'm on, although I didn't tell very many people because I would get lectured for it. But we had a mutual friend, and she sort of shared this information back and forth between us. So he and I used to huddle over by the teacher mailboxes and exchange information. Have you killed any of your patients yet, Eric? And he's like, no. And are you having cravings? And I'm like, no. So 10 years later, when he opened up his clinic at Duke, the lifestyle medicine clinic, he invited me to participate as an office manager and administrator, but found out very soon that I could be helpful in clinic because I actually knew how to cook this food. I knew how to shop for it. I knew how to make up a menu and a grocery list based on reducing carbohydrate and getting adequate protein and not really worrying about fat. So I spent a few years in clinic with him, meeting patients and watching some amazing transformations and also some frustrations because the diet is not, it's, it doesn't always work the way that we think it should with patients. And in doing that, my son's growing up and he's going to Cub Scouts. And who is in Cub Scouts with us but Alex Yancey, who is the son of Will Yancey, who's another well-regarded researcher at Duke and at the VA who studies low carbohydrate diet. So he would pull up the driveway into the driveway to pick up my son so that our kids could play together, and I could run over to the van window and say, Will, what about this study where it says blah, 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 blah? And he would explain to me what was going on. And I mean, I learned so much in my driveway just from talking to Will. So I always felt like in my life, there was this sort of nudge in this direction to learn about this diet and to see what was going on with it. And, I was an English major. I always enjoyed science. I love science, but I was an English major. But I could begin to see where it might be really helpful if I knew more about science and knew more, especially about the science of nutrition. I kept telling myself I was going to go back and become a dietitian and learn this. And I finally, a friend of mine sort of challenged me, you need to go back and do this. And so I did. And it was pretty amazing to begin to put the pieces together. But I really wanted to go back and find the flaws. Like my purpose for going back to school was not to be confirmed in my beliefs about the safety and the efficacy of carbohydrate reduction, but to find out what was wrong with it, because I figured I better find out before somebody else did. And I didn't realize at the time that this was sort of what we would now consider a true scientific skeptic approach. I learned that over time. Mostly I hate being wrong. If anybody knows me, I hate being wrong. And if I'm going to be wrong, I want to know about it before you do. So that's why I went. But during that experience, I began to realize what a politically loaded field I'd gone into. And I'd be over my biochemistry classes where carbohydrate reduction was non-controversial. It was well understood what carbohydrates did and didn't do for the body. And then I'd go across the hall to my intervention and policy classes where fat was evil, protein was disregarded, and carbohydrates were king. And it was weird. It was just weird. So I'm trying to sort this all out in my brain. I figure I need a little more education, so I enrolled in a PhD program there at UNC in nutritional epidemiology, because I thought nutritional epidemiology would bridge the gap between biochemistry, which I loved, and intervention and policy, which just mystified me. And I thought nutritional epidemiology would be the bridge between the two. How wrong I was, I did not know until I was well underway in that program. But what I learned about nutritional epidemiology, so when you're a grad student, and maybe you learn this in your field as well, when you're a grad student, your professors will tell you everything that is wrong with your field of study. I mean, you get to see the seamy underbelly. You get to learn all of the flaws and all of the research, what we do wrong. And I think the idea is so that we can move forward and do it better. But in nutritional epidemiology, it was like I was in this bad relationship. I kept thinking, oh, well, if I just try a little hard, I'll understand it. If I just study a little more, it'll start to make sense. And then finally, I had this realization. It's like nutrition epidemiology, it's not me. It's you.
Okay. Yeah. So there's a lot here that we can unpack. And my greatest hope is that people who are outside of the bubbles that we first met in and still operate in can understand why what we've been told is the healthy diet or health food or any of those concepts. Where did those come from? When did we switch from thinking about animal source foods as essential parts of everyone's diet that we were supposed to make sure we got, to where we now believe that there's somehow a health hazard if you eat too much, whatever that means. How did we come to believe that we can, or a lot of people seeming to me believe that we can accurately estimate what free living human beings eat, we can quantify that, and then we can follow them for a period of time and look at what diseases they come down with, and we can make meaningful associations between those and then make
Well, we can if
confident.
you're in a nutritional epidemiology
Okay,
program.
but as I say, for free living human beings, or even better, for people who are used to conducting plant nutrition studies, and I learned recently that that doesn't mean feeding plants to humans. It means how to properly fertilize plants, or how to feed animals when you can put them into, feeding studies. Sort of compare, contrast, um, look at, and we've talked about this before too, the contrasting animal nutrition with human nutrition from the 1970s to today. And so I guess putting I was having a conversation with a friend just the other day, and I became aware of how much is just part of my background information that I would now wager a large part of the population isn't familiar with and is confused about. And maybe that phrase that you just gave, nutritional epidemiology of chronic disease, is a place for us to start that unpacking.
Yes, yes, it is. Because this didn't used to be a thing. There was no such field as nutrition epidemiology of chronic disease when nutritional epidemiology started. And so what we really have to do is take ourselves back in time to a place where, and this is really hard for people to think about, we simply ate food so it would nourish us. That was really what was going on. Now, I'm not discounting the social and political aspects of food, the moralizing aspects of food. Those have been there forever. Food has always represented more than just something that you eat. But as far as public health was concerned, in the early days of Atwater, when he was telling people what to eat, that was about getting the most amount of nutrition for the least amount of money. And that was about wages, actually. That was so that we could figure out what a living wage was. But the marker was not food that was going to reduce medical costs by preventing chronic disease. What you were looking at, the hallmark of a nutritious diet, was one that provided enough calories, enough protein to allow you to be a worker. And then how much that would cost, and that's what your living wage was. And so actually vegetables were discouraged because they didn't provide a lot of calories. They didn't provide protein at all. So vegetables were considered a luxury for rich people. Rich people could eat vegetables. Poor people needed to avoid them because they were a waste of money. So you were spending your money poorly if you were a poor person and you decided to eat kale. Now, contrast that with what we think about nutrition today, right? So that was in the early 1900s. As the century went on, we learned about vitamins and diseases of deficiency, and this is where nutritional epidemiology started. Now, notice I don't tack on of chronic disease. It's just nutritional epidemiology, and it's that nutritional epidemiology studied the spread of diseases of nutrition the same way that epidemiology studies diseases more generally, which is you kind of look at a population that doesn't have these diseases and you look at a population that does, and you try and figure out what's different between them. For instance, in the US, the northern states did not tend to have outbreaks of pellagra, and the southern, especially the southeastern states, did. And so we tried to figure out what was different. Well, the same things that are different now were different then, which is there's a lot more poverty in the southern US than there is elsewhere in the US. And there are a number of efforts, but famously we figured out that pellagra was caused by a vitamin deficiency having to do with diet that poverty-stricken people would eat. But there's a really important lesson in here, which is that because we could see that pellagra tracked with poverty, one of the important competing hypotheses was that pellagra was caused by poor sanitation. And then another hypothesis was that it was caused by poor diet. And it's important to know that in epidemiology, there was no way to tell the difference between these, except through a more specific or granular study, which would test this idea of it being sanitation versus an idea of it being a dietary deficiency. So Goldberger, he would have these parties where he would have these filth parties, he called them, where you'd take bodily fluids from people with pellagra and ingest them or rub them into open wounds and things like that because if it was transmitted by a germ or a microbe, then he should get it, but he didn't. They would look at orphanages where the orphans all had pellagra, but the staff didn't. Well, if it was transmissible via germ, you would think there would be some transmission. So even though the correlation between poor sanitation and pellagra was very, very strong, it was not causal. You could wash your hands all day long and, have new plumbing and have indoor plumbing and all of this hygiene. You were never going to get rid of pellagra unless you changed the diet of the people who were affected. So that's a critical piece that we have to understand about epidemiology. It never shows us causation. It can show predictive factors, which is I can predict that this population, because it has poor sanitation related to poverty, that it's more likely to have pellagra. And I can predict that this population, because it has a poor diet related to poverty, is more likely to have pellagra. But only one of those is causal, and we don't know which until we do the appropriate studies. So what we did was we took this model, which worked great on diseases of deficiency and also diseases of toxicity. So aflatoxin, which is a mold that grows on corn, like we could track an aflatoxin outbreak because the toxic, using the same sort of tools. Who has it, who doesn't, where did it start, what is it associated with, and then do the experiments to try and figure out whether or not those associations are causal. So we took this model, and as we began to discover all of the vitamins and get rid of all of the diseases of deficiency and start to get rid of a lot of the infectious diseases as well, what were we left with? Well, we were left with an aging population that was relatively healthy, but that was now being stricken by these chronic diseases: heart disease, diabetes, stroke, cancer. And while this was happening, so we're beginning to wonder, and Landers famously said, if we can put a man on the moon, why can't we find a cure for cancer? And so our nation's attention began to be focused towards how to intervene with these chronic diseases. And in the early 70s, believe it or not, and in these tumultuous political times, believe it or not, in the early 70s, we had bipartisan support for a national health insurance. Medicare, Medicaid had come through, and those had been considered a great success. And so both conservatives and progressives supported having a national health insurance for everyone. And this was going to help our nation be even healthier than it already was. So take an already healthy nation and give it that kind of support. But then we came to some economically troubled times in the later 70s. And all of a sudden, it was not about expanding these government programs. It was about constricting them. How are we going to save money? Well, if we dealt with hunger and undernutrition and malnutrition, now we were going to deal with overnutrition and obesity. And we were going to begin to intervene with chronic disease by looking at those things. And so we took the model of nutritional epidemiology of deficiencies and we just stuck it on chronic disease, and it didn't work.
And to your earlier point about how we associated pellagra with unsanitary, some did. It seems to me that the same thing has been done with obesity, such that obesity is the cause of these chronic diseases, and then you have the effort being, well, you need to eat less and exercise more so you won't be obese, so you'll lower your risk of these chronic diseases. Is that a
Right. And then you
fair?
ask, is obesity predictive or is it causal? Well, it's clearly predictive, but we don't know yet whether it's causal. And I would argue that if you look at epidemiology of chronic disease and body size, you have this weird arrow shift at either ends of the U-shaped curve. So we know if people are too thin, that they're more likely to die. And if people are too big, they're more likely to die. And what happens? So if you look at the skinny end of the spectrum of that U-shaped curve, right? If somebody is losing weight and can't keep weight on their body, we immediately go, well, there's something wrong with you. We don't turn to them and say, what is the matter with you? Why don't you just eat more food? You need to sit down more and you need to eat more food because you have a character flaw. You have a real problem there. You know what the problem is? You are not addicted to food enough. And we don't do that. We say, there's something wrong with you. You might have cancer and that's why you're losing weight. Or you might have another degenerative disease and that's why you're losing weight. You might have something else metabolically wrong with you and that's why you're losing weight. So the causal arrow goes from disease to weight status, right? And it's clear. It never is the other way around. We don't tell people, you know, if you ate more, you get rid of that cancer. We don't tell that to people.
Yeah, in fact, how many times do we know someone who's lost a significant amount of weight who then sees some people that they haven't seen in a while and they're concerned that the person has cancer?
Yeah.
Right.
Because that's how the causal arrow works at that end of the spectrum, right? Now let's go to the other end of the spectrum. You have a big body, keeps getting bigger. You're not really sure why, because like me, you might even be actively trying to reduce your body size, but
you're doing everything right.
Yeah, you're trying anyway. You're making that effort. And people say to you, what's the matter with you? Why don't you eat less? Why don't you move more? You need to quit eating those foods that make you eat more of those foods. Obviously, you have a problem with hyperpalatable food. You're addicted to food. What's the matter with you? Nobody goes. So then the causal arrow is clearly going from the person and their body size to a disease. If you don't take care of your body, if you don't make your body smaller, you're going to cause yourself to have cancer, diabetes, heart disease, so on, so on, so on, so on. Obesity is going, your obesity, your lack of your ability to maintain the body size that we think is appropriate is going to cause these diseases. So the causal arrow there is very clear as well. Now, the question is, when does it flip, right? Well, I would argue that we are thinking about obesity and body size in the wrong sort of way. And we need to think of it the same way that we think about small body size, which is if somebody's body size is getting bigger and they're eating more than they should, they're overeating, which is a term that just drives me bonkers because how do you know when you've overeaten? Oh, you step on a scale and your weight's gone up. Well, you've already overeaten. When did that happen? And now the only ostensible remedy for that is now to undereat. But if you didn't know you were overeating, how the hell are you going to know how to undereat except without just being hungry?
Yeah, so, we can put a basset on a treadmill, but we can't turn it into a greyhound. There's a certain amount of biology, genetics, but you've used the phrase metabolic health, I believe.
Yes, I love that phrase.
And so let's think about someone who's living in the middle of the country out in a rural area where they aren't getting access to, you know, a lot of research centers or that kind of thing. So what do you mean by metabolic health? What would be Why would somebody maybe become interested in that concept of, personally? What might be a clue to them that that's something they want to learn more about?
Well, just like poverty and poor sanitation are predictive of pellagra, but a nutritional deficiency is the actual cause, I would say that body size and obesity are predictive of chronic disease, but metabolic health or lack thereof is really the cause. So you might be a person who's gained weight over the years. You don't feel like you've changed your diet a whole lot or changed your activity levels a whole lot, but you might be told that, and you might even begin to internalize that. But if you stop eating as much as you would normally otherwise eat, you're hungry, you're tired, you're crabby. So what's going on? And I would say that there's something up with your metabolic health. We've learned to blame ourselves. We've learned to take it upon ourselves to say, oh, I just don't have the willpower, or I'm an emotional eater, I'm addicted to food. We've learned all of those messages because we've been gaslighted by public health to believe that we are the problem. But it makes as much sense to say, I'm a perfectly normal, healthy person, but I somehow, for some reason, it doesn't make any sense, just eat more food than I should. That doesn't make any sense any more than a person who loses weight says, well, I don't know, I'm a normal, healthy person, but I just can't seem to eat enough food. We just don't. So I would say, let's look at that person's metabolic health. And what often you can find when you look closer is that there's something wrong with that person's metabolic health. For me, I learned that my blood sugars were going up. So blood sugars going up is a sign that there's something wrong with your metabolic health. Your body is not able to handle the glucose that's coming in or that your liver is making. Abdominal circumference, so a beer belly or a bread belly, when you are gaining weight, particularly in your abdominal area, that's a sign of poor metabolic health, because it's a way, storing fat in the abdominal area is a way for your body quickly to sort of clean out the blood supply and go, okay, we're going to just stick all these extra calories in here for a while, and we'll get to them, we'll deal with them later. So that's sort of the in and out fat depot, and it tells you that your body is not behaving in a metabolically normal sort of way. Insulin levels, which we hardly ever get checked, but I think it's becoming more often another way of checking on metabolic health. Triglyceride and HDL levels, when your HDL level, that's the good cholesterol, and when those go low and your triglycerides go high, that's another example, at least for white people, of metabolic dysfunction. That seems to be less of a marker for African Americans and other ethnic groups. They just don't experience that same dyslipidemia. Those blood pressure. So if you're African American, you're probably one of the first markers of metabolic poor health that you're going to see is your blood pressure start to go up.
So they should eat less salt, right?
Well, your doctor will tell you that. Your doctor will tell you that you need to lose weight, you need to cut back on your sodium. And while it is true that cutting back on sodium will have an effect on your blood pressure, simply because salt and water travel together. And so you reduce the sodium, you're going to reduce the amount of fluid that your body is carrying around, but your body quickly figures that out and readjusts. There's probably only about 15% of the populations that are truly salt sensitive and need to watch their salt intake for reasons that have to do with hypertension. And obesity is related to hypertension. Your body has to pump harder to get the blood to flow to all of that extra tissue. But if this is not, we could reduce a person's blood pressure without reducing their weight significantly. Will Yancey has demonstrated this. So you don't have to lose a whole lot of weight to be able to reduce your blood sugar, and we do it by reducing carbohydrate. Now, part of that is loss of sodium as well, but part of that is other effects that excess glucose in the bloodstream have on your whole metabolic profile. So all of these metabolic conditions can be addressed to a greater or lesser extent by reducing the carbohydrates in your diet. And when I say reducing the carbohydrates in your diet, I don't mean eliminating them. And I don't mean reducing them down to zero, although you could if you wanted to. But I mean just cutting out the things that are not nutritionally dense, that don't have a lot of other things going for them, like vitamins and minerals, and pasta, whole grains, breads, cereals. I mean, a cereal in a box, the nutrition that's in there has been put in there via supplements. It's sprayed on like a tan. It's like a spray on tan. It's spray on nutrition. You could just eat wood shavings and a multivitamin. It's the same difference. So those are the carbohydrates that we don't really need. And, you know, if you take those out and you put in more vegetables, which have fewer calories, and you put in the protein that your body actually needs, you're starting to have something that looks like a low carb diet, but you don't have to call it that. You can just take out the unnecessary carbohydrates and reduce your calories and increase your veggie consumption. And those are things that public health is telling us that we need to do anyway, right?
Yeah. And I think that you would add the refined sugar in either adding it to drinks or sugar sweetened beverages, fruit juices probably as well.
That's another spray on nutrition. You know, you think that orange juice is good for you. Well, you drink some water and take a vitamin C tablet, because that's what it is. It has vitamin C added to it. The vitamin C doesn't stay in there.
Well, I've been on a bit of a investigation looking into protein and how we talk about it. And there's something called browning in forages when you make silage or hay at an improper moisture. And that browning results in parts of the crude protein fraction binding with carbohydrate in the forage material and becoming less digestible to the cow that you're going to feed it to. And apparently when we make bread and make crust, or we make breakfast cereals and make them nice and toasty brown, we're doing exactly the same thing. So the lysine seems to be particularly susceptible to this and may become essentially indigestible in, you know, cereals, and those are made from something that didn't start out with a whale of a lot of it to begin with. So one of these little interesting little interactions or intersections. So
you want me to go back to the story to
sure.
the 19th? What happened with nutritional epidemiology? And how did we get here to believe all of these things were cereals and breads and whole wheat pasta was good for us?
Well, yeah, I guess it's important. I would think it's important for people to understand that what we've been told about what constitutes a healthy diet isn't as well-founded as people have represented it to us as being. And that conversely, people can actually enjoy eggs for breakfast and, you know, chicken with the skin for lunch and a hamburger for dinner. And if they combine that with some leafy greens, you may find, as you were just laying out, a lot of conditions that a lot of people are concerned about because they manifest them may get better. And you may enjoy your mealtime a little bit more, but that's a judgment on my part.
People like their pasta and their bread and all the rest of that. But
Indeed.
I do think that the protein part is critical. We have in the keto world now, and I have to say that the keto world they haven't had as much time, but there is at least as much information around the internet keto diet as there is around the DGA low fat diet. and with as little evidence to back it up. So we got to the point where we believed that whole grains and complex carbohydrates, all of this were healthy for us. There's a scientific story, but there's a very strong political story that's a part of it that we forget about. So the scientific story has to do with Ansel Keys, and I suspect a lot of the listeners might already know about him. And there's this notion that he railroaded through this idea that saturated fat was bad for you, that cholesterol was bad for you. And actually, the cholesterol part's not true. That was somebody else's theory. But it just goes to show you that all of these theories just sort of got clumped together when McGovern was working on these 1977 dietary goals. So he had his hearings, and they had a parade of people come and tell them their theories about what diets were related to what chronic diseases. So there was Ansel Keys and saturated fat. There was Connor and Hegstead and cholesterol. There was Yudkin and sugar. There was Atkins and carbohydrates in general, et cetera, et cetera. There were groups that believed that there were food additives and colorings, and that was what was poisoning us, et cetera, et cetera. And the McGovern committee sort of took all of these things and just clumped them together in a big ball and said, okay, now we've got all of the theories together, and we're going to be able to prevent all of the diseases, all of the chronic diseases known to mankind with this one diet that's going to rule them all. But the political twist to that is that around the same time, we were being faced with what we thought was going to be a population crisis, right? So the 1980s, this is, McGovern's committee is in the late 70s. In the 1980s, we were supposed to have worldwide famines where people would not be able to feed themselves. We were having environmental crises then, not like global warming is now, but at that point, it was more about how much petroleum is it taking to process these things, and we're going to run out of energy, and they're starving people in the world, and all of these other considerations, as well as some other environmental concerns related to things like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and stuff like that. So the storyline or the narrative that got put forward is that we need to quit feeding grains to animals because the animals were a poor use of that energy, both in terms of the fossil fuels, but also in terms of just the calories. So they would say, you have a field of wheat, and that's 500,000 calories. Those calories could go into humans, but we put them into a herd of animals, and they only make up 10,000 calories. So, but what's lost in that translation is the quality of the calorie. So animals can take very low quality food. In fact, some food, as you said, with forage foods that humans can't even consume, and they can turn it into very high quality, very nutritious food: milk, meat, eggs, etc. So if you're just counting calories, yeah, it doesn't look like it makes sense. But if you're looking at quality of calories, it's a really nice trade-off.
Well, yeah, we could certainly dig into that, and maybe that's for another conversation, because there's almost the argument that says once we've taken care of raw caloric sufficiency, right? If you're starving, you have one problem, and you must take care of that. But once we get past that and we want to think about what does it take to properly nourish a human being so that they can develop properly, one, to the degree that we can know that, that ought to be the focus on what we need to produce, not looking at these sort of arithmetic calculations. Number two is, as you've said, we look at a calorie from plant source and we act as if it's equivalent as a calorie from an animal source. We do the same thing with protein. We do the same thing with micronutrients, et cetera, et cetera. You mentioned the word quality. You've also mentioned nutrient density, and that's something else I could go off on. But I want to get to quality, because part of this also is I can't afford to feed my family on grass-fed beef, right? So, and I've had people who I think a great deal of, but they've said things along the lines of, if you're not going to get somebody to eat an entirely certified organic diet, you might as well let them remain on the standard American SAD diet.
No.
And
No, just no, no,
yeah,
no.
just no. So one of the best stories I heard was a story a woman told about, it involved spam. And spam is one of those sort of quintessential bad, poor quality, meats. And I just want to know, what do we know about these quality arguments, dreaded air quotes, and where did that come from? You've told a story about a man eating at a buffet. So thinking about people who might be listening to this, who the economic challenge is real, and how can they, what sorts of options should they be looking for in the food landscape that we have, at least in the United States, in terms of being able to afford, I'll just say, animal source foods versus the plant source foods?
So you go in the grocery store and the white eggs in the styrofoam carton, they're like 79 cents a dozen. And the brown eggs in the triple fold see-through carton that are, cage free and, swaddled in cashmere or whatever they do to those particular chickens, those eggs are $5 a dozen. And I can tell you that there's no difference in those eggs, except their color. Nutritionally, they're the same thing. Maybe the only drawback is that you can't recycle the styrofoam. I don't know, but you can make some cute little crafts out of it. I don't know. You can figure that out. But there's no difference in the quality of protein that you're getting from an egg that costs 5 times as much as another egg. And this is true of just about every kind and quality of meat there is out there. Okay.
So you were talking about better quality meat when we ended.
Yep. So in terms of nutritional quality, I don't think that there's any major differences between grass-fed animals, pasture-raised animals, organic. I mean, the organic label is a concept that actually went, it's a word that means something, but it doesn't mean what we think it means. What we wanted it to mean when it came out was something that was non-toxic, something that was going to protect the environment and the farm workers, but we should have chosen that word. We should have said non-toxic, but organic means something else. It draws this rhetorical line between things that are man-made and things that are not man-made. So it's organic, it's made by nature. And we use it to describe pesticides and fertilizers and things like that. And so organic produce or organically fed animals are fed foodstuffs or are foodstuffs that are not, that no man-made pesticides or man-made fertilizers have been used on.
I guess the way that I would put it is that they've been raised using inputs that are approved by certifying authorities.
Yep. Exactly.
So,
but this doesn't make them more or less toxic than non-organic inputs.
yeah. So again, I don't know that you're the one that said it, but whoever said it, making this information accessible and actionable by more people, I just see as a critical need in this country of, you find yourself in this condition, which we've described as metabolic health or lack of it. In fact, you told me, what was it, that our focus ought to be on achieving adequate essential nutrition and
Yep.
then maintaining, or to the degree we can, restoring metabolic health.
Right.
And then leave it up to the individuals to make choices once they're given the information.
Yep.
And those choices are going to be driven by economic
Yep.
situation, their
Preferences.
cultural
Yep.
background, their personal choices in the moment.
And
Um,
their own personal health.
mhm,
So, you
mhm,
know, not everyone is susceptible to the same chronic diseases. My family, diabetes runs in my family.
mhm,
Heart disease does not, but in other people's family, heart disease is the big, um, is what is in everybody's background. Saying that there's one diet that's going to equally prevent both diseases and not raise your risk of the other doesn't make any sense. And they're
mm,
two very, very different diseases. Why would there be one diet that's going to prevent both of them? It's absurd on its face. That's like saying one adjustment that we can make to cars is going to prevent both traffic accidents and um, you know,
paint oxidation.
exactly. Exactly. Thank you for that. So it
Yeah,
just
you.
doesn't make any sense. There are two different problems. They should be addressed differently. And what we're finding, we think, is that actually one intervention that's supposed to reduce your risk of one disease may raise your risk of another disease. So a lower saturated fat, lower cholesterol diet may or may not reduce your risk of heart disease, but it seems to impact for some part of the population their risk of diabetes. I was certainly
Mhm,
one of those people.
mm, mm. Well, and so um, once again, my friend, I thank you for agreeing to kick us off here. I'm learning every time about podcasting. So forgive me for any flubs and things. Every time I speak with you, I learn something. It's always a pleasure. Where can people find more about you, what you've written? What are you mentioned Diet Doctor before. Could you talk a little bit about that, please?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I am employed by dietdoctor.com. That's how you can find it on the internet. It is a health company that specializes in carbohydrate reduction for therapeutic purposes. We have a free continuing medical education course for physicians who want to learn more about this. But because it's free, you can take it even if you're not a clinician and just learn more about reducing carbohydrates for therapeutic purposes. It's got all kinds of wonderful information and recipes and things like that on it, and for all kinds of eaters. So it definitely has meat-based recipes, but it also has vegetarian and vegan recipes because carbohydrate reduction is a non-denominational intervention. It is agnostic as to what the background diet is. You can be carnivore, you can be a vegan, and you can still experience some of the benefits of carbohydrate reduction to different degrees, perhaps, but everybody can do it. Everybody can get rid of carbohydrates in their diet that they don't need, that aren't providing a lot of nutrition, and eat more of the foods that are providing them with protein, with vitamins and minerals and things like that. So and Diet Doctor has all of that information. I do have a long neglected blog site called eathropology.com. You can find me arguing with people on Twitter all the time, and I argue with people on all along the dietary ideology spectrum, from vegans to carnivores, because I think that we are all wrong on one really important point, which is that we think we know what diet, usually the diet that we follow,
Mm-hmm.
is going to prevent chronic disease. And I would argue that we know no such thing.
Mm-hmm.
That is, you have moved into the area of belief. When you step forward and you say, this diet, this way of eating is going to prevent X chronic disease or Y chronic disease or all of the chronic diseases, as our DGA proposes, you're not in the area of evidence anymore. You're in the area of speculation and belief. It's a religious system. It's not a scientific system. And that is one of the big mistakes. And what we've done as a result is that we've turned, if you should acquire a chronic disease, if you should become ill, guess whose fault it is? It's your fault, right?
Well, and the dietary guidelines are no longer intended for you because obviously you failed.
Right.
So
You failed. You didn't follow them, and now you're sick, and it's all your fault.
So the therapeutic carbohydrate reduction has begun to be accepted within certain professional groups. Is that a correct statement?
Yes, the American Diabetes Association and diabetes groups in English-speaking countries, so in Canada, in the UK, I'm not sure about Australia. Australia is sort of a weird anomaly sometimes when it comes to diabetes, but particularly for diabetes and prediabetes, we have really solid evidence that we can put diabetes into remission. We can reverse the symptoms of diabetes, which are climbing blood glucose and other metabolic issues. And we can do it, here's the kicker, without forcing you to lose a lot of weight. Now, it's very likely that you'll lose some weight after a while, but not everybody loses weight, and weight loss isn't critical. You can succeed in putting your diabetes into remission, into getting off of glucose-lowering medications, all of that, without losing weight. And so you have the right, if you have diabetes or prediabetes, to ask your doctor to help you do that and to quit badgering you about how much you weigh.
And I guess it's probably appropriate for us to somewhere along the line say that neither of us are medical physicians or medical doctors. That
but I am a registered dietitian.
There you go. There you go. So and the information is available, and we want people to become more aware of the information so that they can have informed conversations with their healthcare practitioners. And I just think it's some of the best news in today's world that if the numbers are right and 50% of, or more than half of adult Americans have diabetes or prediabetes, majority of those being type 2 diabetes. But even with type 1 diabetes, there are people who are just, it's not the same, but people are learning how to live with type 1 diabetes, but with restricted carbohydrate and managing all the necessary medications, and finding health benefits from that approach. So it's just really important for more and more people to find out about this. Thank you for all that you've been doing. Thank you for the effect that you had in my life. I do remember the night when we both felt like we had lost out at the dinner table and didn't get to sit next to the cool people. And as it turns out, I think we both won. Well, I'd like to think I won.
I definitely did. I told you on that flight to Seattle, I was banging my head against the bulkhead going, oh my gosh, I have to learn forestry too, on top of learning biochemistry.
No, you don't. No, you don't. There's a whole world of us, and it's been my pleasure to introduce you to some of them.
Yes.
And I look forward to doing more of that. We've got some projects in the works. So in whatever comes after this, I hope we get to achieve some of them. But yeah, thank you for taking the time. Thank you for being episode number 1, and all the best to you, my friend.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure, and I really look forward to seeing what unfolds and who your guests will be and continuing this conversation for years to come.